So this next phase we're going to cover those first philosophers, really setting the stage for Socrates. Socrates, the first major, well, often called the father of Western philosophy, but really he's going to be one of the most influential and most important philosophers in the Western canon. So today we're going to talk about those individuals leading up to Socrates and to kind of lay the foundation for what's to come. So our pre-Socratic philosophers, those coming before Socrates, their focus is on metaphysics, and we talked about the different branches of philosophy last week. These thinkers, these Western philosophers, are going to be focused on metaphysics. They're looking for the basis for ultimate reality. They're looking for the RK is the word, A-R-C-H-E, the RK, which is the literally translates to first principle. Basically, it's going to be that fundamental component of all reality. You may know the word archetype. So that idea of an underlying symbol that comes out of this Greek idea, arche. So here's a little map of the ancient world, ancient Greece, and then we'll get a little more specific as we move through. So we'll start with these folks. They're going to be the very first Western philosophers. And so what makes them philosophers and not something else? Well, first and foremost, they no longer rely on divine revelation for their answers, right? They're going to rely solely on reason for their answers to the fundamental questions, right? They're also the first to put forth some basic principles of nature. Now, this Nietzsche does a good job discussing the importance of the pre-Socratics, and it really comes down to that idea of stepping away from myth, stepping away from a kind of religious thinking and moving to using reason alone to come up with answers. So you see these three reasons why, or what makes the pre-Socratic philosophers different from what came before, right? That first, they're trying to tell us something about origins. Secondly, they're telling us about those origins without using figure or fable. And then thirdly, it's that idea of arche, that everything is connected, that there is a fundamental principle that holds everything together. And this idea of the arche will become a little clearer as we move through and talk about specific pre-Socratic philosophers. And when Nietzsche talks about doing without figure or fable, he's referring to a famous Greek poet, Hesiod, who kind of writes the origin myth for the ancient Greeks. Right? For him, all is chaos, right? Out of chaos, something. It's an origin story, but it's a poem, it's a myth, it's a fable. All right, so here's who is considered our first Western philosopher. That's Thales, and he believed that the arche was water. All is water. And of course, for him, looking out at the world and using only his intellect, his ability to reason, right? He sees that, and we'll go back to our map. What do you see surrounding everything in the ancient Greek world, right? It's water. And also he knows, if he's cut, if he's wounded, what comes out, some kind of liquid, right? So for him, everything was water. Next, a student of Thales, this is Anaximander, and Anaximander believed that the fundamental principle was the infinite, the indeterminate, that the arche was boundless. All right, and then here's another map. This is kind of this is what Italy, well, you'll see. Okay, the Ionians, they believed in the soul, right? A soul that was possibly immortal. The Greek word psyche, pronounced suke. They believed that this animating force could pass on to animals, etc. So for them, the arche, the fundamental principle, wasn't necessarily observable. They were increasingly mystical in their thinking, whereas Thales would say all is this thing, water, right? This very tangible sort of thing. Our Ionians have a different view. So you're familiar with this fellow if you've taken your geometry classes, right? That he believed the arche was number. Gives us the Pythagorean theorem, etc. Next, Heraclitus, again an Ionian, and he believed that all is flux. That is, all is change. That the fundamental principle of reality is change. All right, now we're on to our Eleatics. And they believed that this idea that you could logically investigate reality, that you could actually discover something about reality using reason, they believed that this is impossible, this sort of scientific thinking. And so most famously, Parmenides, and so you see his argument here, the concept of the non-existent is impossible, right? Because and this is his response to Heraclitus, the idea of change requires the concept of the non-existent, right? That is, in order for something to become something else, it has to not be, even if it's just momentarily, yes? Or it has to cease being what it was, right? So for him, he said that, or he believed that this proved that those fundamental concepts, or that those other pre-Socratics were incorrect in trying to understand reality using reason. So I hope you've noticed that really our pre-Socratics are responding to one another, right? So it makes it easy to keep them in line because they are responding. So the student of Parmenides, and probably the most famous, is Zeno. Zeno's famous for his paradoxes. So you see here the arrow paradox, right? That if I use my logic, if I use my reason to really investigate the circumstances around an arrow moving through space, right? That when we talk about movement, what is movement? You'll see that movement, or in order for an arrow to go from, say, your bow to a target, that arrow must pass through an infinite number of, or many, many points. And as an arrow reaches each point, right, it's at that point for a specific period of time. Now, if an arrow is at a point for a specific period of time, we would call that arrow at rest. So instead of movement, the arrow is actually constantly at rest. And then the midway problem, another famous paradox, along with Achilles and the tortoise. Basically, if you want to, say, walk from one side of a room to another, before you can get to the other side, you have to go halfway. You have to walk halfway. And before you can get halfway across the room, you have to get half of halfway, or a quarter. And in order for you to get a quarter of the way, you have to go an eighth of a way. And in order to get the eighth, you have to go a 16th and a 32nd, etc., etc., etc. And so eventually, you don't move. You can never cross the room. And again, the important thing here is that when we evaluate these situations using our logic, using our reason, we find that they're actually impossible, right? And yet, we know that we can do them, right? This is what makes them paradoxes. And then lastly are atomists. You may be familiar with Democritus, and the atomists believe that the arche was an undividable thing, a particle, and they called it the atom, right? Which means, literally translates to uncuttable. So, in some ways, ahead of their time. And then, really previous to Socrates, and the most important jumping off point for Socratic thinking is our sophists. And this is going to relate back to our discussion of relativism and universalism, that the sophists, they were relativists who believed that there was no objective absolute truth, right? That it was only those who had the most convincing argument that had the truth. So sophists, they were teachers. They taught the young citizens of ancient Athens, and they taught them in the ways of rhetoric, persuasive argument. And the most famous sophist is going to be Protagoras. Right? And he argued that man is actually the measure of all things, that there is no absolute truth. Right? So his example is a bowl of lukewarm water. That if I'm, outside in the shoveling snow, right, and I come in and I take my gloves off and I put my hands in the lukewarm water, that water is going to feel very warm to me. And yet if I take the same bowl of water and I'm out mowing a half acre in mid-July, and I come back in and I put my hands in that same bowl of water, it's going to feel very cool. So Protagoras said, obviously, the truth concerning the temperature of that water is going to be relative to the individual. It's going to change. There is no absolute truth.